By the Fire presents A Desperate Soul by Dave Smale. Read for you by the author. Chapter 3. Jacob and Benzonato, Benz Terzo, his bandmate and best acquaintance, arrived at the apartment of their elder bandmate, Oscar Bean Sepulveda, 20 minutes later. Benz's family had moved to America when he was 4 years old. His father was an American sailor who'd met Benz's mother while stationed in Sigonella, Sicily. So, Benz had no trace of an accent. While the nickname Benz was an abbreviation of his native Italian name, Oscar claimed to have earned his nickname Bean as a result of being half Mexican. Though the nickname was derogatory, Bean said he embraced it as proof of America's racist past. Although he'd never say when or how he'd earned the nickname. Benz and Jacob were nearly the same age, Jacob being barely a month older. Bean, however, was already 21 and was the assistant manager at Galactic Music, an indie record store. It was there he'd first met Jacob, who was a regular, or at least a regular loiterer. Soon after meeting him, Bean recruited Jacob to be his guitar player and talked the store manager into hiring him. Bean was the lead singer and bassist in their gothic metal band Smoke Rings, or, as Bean branded them, dark metal. He was quick to correct anyone that labeled their band as goth. He did not want to limit their style to a single genre, since they infused elements of old-school heavy metal and psychedelic rock into their songs. Dark metal seemed to be fit branding, and it had resonated with fans. Their popularity had practically exploded in the region in a relatively short period. Having moved out of his mother's house without her consent years earlier, Bean lived in the apartment with a roommate named Gavin, who wasn't around much. He worked part-time at Galactic Music and full-time as a waiter. Gavin in Bean's apartment was a party pad. Most days, underage boys and girls stopped by just to hang out, some getting high during their visits. The parties went all out on the weekends. Jacob had drunk himself into a cold spot on the tile under the toilet multiple times. Though rambunctious, the police never broke up their parties. They lived in a rough part of town where cops were busy with real problems like shootings and local gang activity. "What up, bros?" Bean hollered from his love seat as his younger bandmates entered. "Yo," Ben said. "Hey," Jacob said, entering with his backpack, amp, and guitar. "Where can I put my stuff?" Bean was watching his favorite movie, Clerks, for the umpteenth time, and his attention was immediately diverted back to it. He suddenly burst out laughing. "Jay and Silent Bob frickin' kill me," Bean said through laughter. Jacob stood by, awkwardly awaiting an answer. Once he stopped laughing, a few moments later, Bean cut his eye at Jacob. But then he refocused on the movie. "I don't know, by the door, I guess," he said dismissively. Bean sat up, then leaned over the coffee table. It was a mess of food wrappers, empty plastic cups, loose change, and miscellaneous junk left by past partygoers. He rummaged through the pile and found what he was looking for. His pipe. Not a tobacco pipe. The device, a stainless steel hashish pipe, had a name etched on it. Talitha. Most people with whom Bean partied asked him why he'd named the pipe, and what the name meant. Like the origin of his nickname, he'd never given anyone a straight answer. To some, he said Talitha was simply a cool name he'd heard somewhere. To others, he said it was the name of an ancient mythical demon that tormented anyone it chose. Whatever the case, he clearly had an obsession with the name. He'd written it in several of his lyric notebooks and even titled a song by it. Their band always performed the song as a closer, though Bean was never satisfied with the way it sounded. He'd never say what was wrong with it. Bean reached into his pocket and produced a sandwich baggie with a scant amount of bud left in it. He pulled out a lighter from his other pocket. He packed marijuana tightly into the pipe's bowl. Bean turned the lighter sideways and flicked, while simultaneously inhaling. The flame was sucked down into the bowl, igniting the weed which glowed like a campfire ember. "Yo, bro, you're not going to be stingy with that, are you?" Benz asked. "Yeah, dude, get your own," Bean answered, exhaling a massive plume of smoke. "Come on, man," Benz moaned. "Dude, I'm messing with you." Bean handed Benz the pipe and the lighter. Benz took an exaggerated drag, causing Bean to protest. Benz laughed as he exhaled, which made him cough uncontrollably for a half a minute. "Yeah, that's what you get," Bean said. Jacob was about to ask for a hit, but decided he wasn't in the mood. Plus, he was already asking a lot of Bean, moving into his apartment on short notice and all. He didn't want to wear out his welcome too soon. It was best not to get on Bean's bad side. He could be a jerk. In fact, he was a jerk most of the time, but especially when he was stoned. The trio left for their gig 10 minutes later. Benz drove to his house to retrieve his drums while Jacob rode with Bean and their equipment. During the ride, Bean gave Jacob the lowdown on what he expected from him as a roommate. "Listen, bro," Bean began, noticeably slower than normal. "First thing is, you can stay as long as you need, but you've got to get a license and a car, like, real soon. I can't be giving you rides all the time. And also, Gavin doesn't know you're going to be living here, so I don't know how he's going to be about it. He should be cool, though. I'll talk to him." "That's cool, man. Thanks for letting me stay," Jacob said. "Oh, and $250 a month for now, okay? And you gotta buy your own food." "Okay. Wait, for now?" Jacob asked. "Yeah, 'cause I know you just got kicked out, so I don't want to be too harsh. We pay $950 a month plus electric. Water's free. Well, it's included in the rent, so I think $250 is fair." "Okay, but it's going to go up eventually?" "I mean, yeah," said Bean. "Okay, like, how much, just so I can be ready?" Bean screwed up his face. "Dude, I don't know. I can't think about that right now." Jacob wisely changed the subject. "No worries. Hey, you got the set list for tonight?" he asked. Bean looked even more annoyed. "Don't change the subject." I wasn't. I didn't mean... "You know what?" Bean snapped. "Find another ride home, bro. You're ruining my high." He finished by cursing. Jacob was used to Bean's attitude, and the fact that he was prone to taking things the wrong way, blowing them out of proportion quickly. He guessed, based on experience, that after the show, Bean would be sober. He would forget about the incident and give him a ride. It was a vicious cycle, one of which Bean was unable to come out, especially since he didn't realize he was in it. As Tilda sat waiting in the exam room, she couldn't help but reflect on her day. The call she'd received from her doctor's office was urgent, demanding she come in for an urgent consultation. She'd had her annual mammogram a week ago, and the results were negative. What could this be about? At their urging, she left work early, which was how she'd learned of Jacob's intent to leave, when she stopped by the house to fetch her insurance card and found him asleep instead of at school. And then, the awful argument. And then he left. The door opened, startling her from her memory. The doctor entered, a somber look on her face. "Good afternoon, Miss O'Brien," the doctor said. "Likewise, doctor. What is this all about?" The doctor took a seat across from her. "As you know, the results of your mammogram were negative," the doctor said, and Tilda nodded. "But the results of your pap smear showed cancerous cells." Tilda gasped. "I'd like to get you in to see an oncologist right away. I'm hoping we've caught it early enough, and it's treatable." "You don't sound too optimistic," Tilda said. The doctor said nothing, exhaling a deep breath. "So, where is it exactly?" Tilda asked, a hint of panic rising in her voice. "Uterus? Ovaries?" "I'm not sure. That's why we need to get you in to see a specialist, ASAP." Tilda felt the onset of dizziness as the doctor handed her a referral card for a, quote, "really good oncologist I know, probably the best in the state." She read the card. Oncology Partners of Virginia, Dr. Pollock. The doctor spoke for a few more minutes, but Tilda didn't hear a word of it. When the doctor finished, Tilda thanked her and left the office. She meant to go home, but involuntarily detoured and ended up at a Walmart. She wandered the aisles there, lost in thought for hours. It was closing in on 7 p.m. when she finally checked her watch. And it was Friday. The oncology place was surely closed. At least she hoped it was. She really didn't feel like calling them. She'd wait until Monday. "Goodness gracious," she thought. "What a day." Thoughts mishmashed in Tilda's head during the drive home. She hadn't been hungry lately and had lost nearly 20 pounds. She had been nauseous and experienced lower abdominal pain for the past few weeks. Or had it been months? She hadn't kept track. She chalked it up to normal changes in her body associated with either menopause, getting older, or both. She hadn't had medical insurance when the pain started, therefore she didn't pay much attention to it. Her temp job as a file clerk had only hired her on as a full-time employee a month ago. With her hiring came medical benefits. She scheduled her first appointment a few weeks ago, only when she was reminded about her abdominal pains by a fit of severe cramping. Between all of Jacob's troublemaking and the issues she was dealing with at church, she hadn't given much time to her own health. She pulled into her driveway 15 minutes later. Her hands trembled as she shut off the engine. Apparently, the news had finally sunk in. Her body was going into shock. Cancer. A silent killer that had somehow slipped into her body uninvited. It had but one mission: to end her life. And there was nothing she could do about it. The situation was exasperated by the reality that her grandson, her sole charge in life, had run away today. How could she have let that happen? Everything seemed so far from her control. She felt helpless. With her thoughts running like a hamster wheel, she hadn't noticed her breaths becoming fast and shallow. Her pulse quickened, and it soon thumped against her chest wall like a pounding timpani. Tilda's vision blurred, mind swirling in a tangled mess. Panic was setting in. Her arms, shoulders, torso, and legs shook uncontrollably. Then the cramping came, sharp and intense, worse than she'd experienced yet. She felt as if she'd black out in a moment if she didn't do something. She'd never been in this much physical pain, nor experienced a panic attack before. She had no idea what to do. Without any other inkling, she threw her head back and screamed, "Jesus!" Still shaking. "Jesus, help me!" No change. "Jesus, I need you!" The shaking abated. The pain dulled, then disappeared. Her vision righted, breathing stabilized, and the pounding in her chest slowed. But her thoughts were still racing. Suddenly, her car door opened. She looked up, startled. "Miss Tilda, you all right?" someone said, startling her. It was her neighbor. She knew him, but what was his name again? She thought. Yes, I'm fine," she said. "You sure?" "Reggie, that's his name. He's a nice man." "Yes, Reggie. It's just, I've got a lot going on." Just then, Reggie's wife, Monica, walked up and knelt beside Tilda. "Sweetie," she said, placing her hand gently on Tilda's shoulder. "You all right?" Tilda smiled and nodded at Monica, still in somewhat of a daze. Reggie and Monica were relatively close in age to Tilda. In fact, they were just a few years younger. They had been her neighbors for 10 years. They, too, knew Jacob and also knew what a struggle it had been for Tilda to raise him, especially the past couple years. "Why don't we call you an ambulance?" Reggie suggested.
"Oh, no," Tilda said. "I'll be fine. It's been a long day."
"Do you want us to call someone else for you? Maybe your pastor?" Monica asked.
"No,"
Tilda said, a little more forcefully than she intended.
"Oh,
everything okay with him?" Monica asked. Though they went to a different church, her neighbors knew Tilda had a long-standing relationship with her pastor and his wife. They guessed, correctly, that the pastor's wife must have been Tilda's best friend as much as they were together.
"Yes, it's just, as I said, it's been a hard day."
Reggie and Monica glanced at each other.
Okay, listen," Monica said. "Have you eaten already?"
Tilda shook her head.
"I made lasagna. You and Jacob want to come join us?"
Tilda pondered for a moment. She wasn't hungry, but knew she should eat. And she could use the fellowship.
I'd love to. Jacob won't be, though. He left earlier today. I can tell you more inside."
She braced herself as she climbed out of the car. Reggie held an arm for a few steps until she said she was all right to walk unassisted.
"Thanks, you two,"
she said as she entered Reggie and Monica's house.
"You're some of the best friends I have."
"Hey, it's Jacob. I'm not a real rock star, but I might loosely be based on the author, who's also not a rock star. Hey, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes and tell you about Anchor. If you haven't heard about it, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Let me explain. First off, it's free. Also, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast, like right from your phone or computer. Anchor will distribute your podcast so it can be heard on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and many more. You can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership, and it's everything you need to make a podcast all in one place. So download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm right now to get started.
The little dive of a club was packed, wall to wall, with eager fans. Jacob thought they'd shut the club down if the fire department showed up, because it was way over capacity. 2 other local goth bands had primed the crowd. One was called Black Tie Affair, the other was Valhalla's Wardrobe. Smoke Rings was tonight's headliner, and they were virtually electric in their presentation. Jacob was an exceptional guitarist, unquestionably the best musician of the 3. Benz was a pretty good drummer. Bean was a decent bassist, but what he was really known for was his deep, romantically sinister vocal style. They'd just finished a fan favorite, Sola Lamia, a song about falling in love at first sight with a vampiress while she was still in bat form. The air thick with fog machine smoke. Jacob couldn't see the set list taped to the stage at his feet. He started to panic. What was the next song? How many had they played thus far? Was this the last song, or the second to last? Suddenly, Bean launched into an a cappella chorus, and Jacob knew he didn't need to check the set list. Little woman shall not stand. It was the intro to their final song, Talitha. Bean paused for effect. The crowd erupted and then joined in singing. Kneel before thy master. I created thee by my hand. Talitha, worship thy father. In anticipation, Jacob's index finger lay across the second frets of the E and A strings on his Jackson 7-string guitar. In unison, the band struck the first beat of the song. Jacob strummed an open low B chord, then dropped into the main riff, a simple B, G, F sharp bass line. The stage lights split the darkness in a flash, syncing perfectly with the music. The bass line repeated 3 times with an E minor that was thrown in every 4th bar. Bean wrote the music for the song, the only song for which he'd written both music and lyrics. The music was simpler than Jacob liked, so he'd added a complex guitar lead. He personally didn't care for the song's lyrics. They were weird, as if Bean had been on a Shakespeare kick when he'd written them. Still, he didn't mind playing it. The song utilized both his delay and his wah-wah effect pedals, giving the song an otherworldly sound. The crowd went wild, jumping to the rhythm. An impromptu mosh pit broke out during the first verse and continued through the second chorus. The bridge of the song came, which meant Jacob's guitar solo was coming up. As he looked over the audience, he thought there was no better feeling in the world than playing for a live crowd who enjoyed your music. It was potent, intoxicating, addictive. At the very front of the reverberating crowd stood a girl with her gaze fixed on Jacob. For a moment, Jacob thought she looked out of place. Virtually everyone at their shows was a goth. They wore black shirts, black pants, black boots, and dyed jet black hair. Girls painted their fingernails black. So did some of the guys. And wore black lipstick. So did some of the guys. But the girl staring at him was blonde. She wore a black t-shirt, a smoke rings shirt. Yet nothing else about her was black. Over her t-shirt was an open red-fitted flannel. A pair of classic Chuck Taylor high tops and high-cut blue jean shorts rounded out the outfit. Her makeup accentuated her model-like features. Jacob thought she looked more like someone he'd see in an Abercrombie & Fitch catalog than in one of their shows. Jacob's solo came. His fingers flew, hammering frets at incredible speeds. His other hand picked the strings so fast that he was surprised he didn't snap any of them, or shred his guitar pick into plastic shavings. Just as the rest of his guitaring, it was flawless. He'd even thrown in a couple extra notes, just for artistic effect. The Abercrombie model was mesmerized. The final chord and cymbal crashed, signaling the end of the song. They'd done a great job tonight, especially on their final song. Yet as Jacob looked over at Bean, he was surprised to see his band leader glaring at him. Bean turned back to the audience, thanked them, and said goodnight. As they exited the stage, Bean said, "Just had to show off, didn't you?" "Huh?" Jacob asked, surprised. "I saw that girl in the front checking you out. Next time, don't use my song to get yourself laid." Jacob's jaw dropped. It was no secret that Bean was a jerk, but to accuse him of... His thoughts were cut short by the audience repeatedly chanting, "Smoke rings! Smoke rings!" Bean's expression changed. An arrogant smirk crawled across his lips. "We'll talk about this later. For now, let's give them what they want," he said. They retook the stage, bathed in cheers, but barely visible behind the smoke and the scant lighting. Jacob strapped on his guitar and mashed a button on his programmable effect pedal. A pre-recorded sample he'd made weeks ago played over the club's speakers. The audience recognized it right away. The acoustic guitar intro to Metallica's classic song, Fade to Black. Playing the song presented a challenge. Metallica had 2 guitar players, whereas Smoke Rings had 1. Jacob made up for it by recording the acoustic parts ahead of time, so he could play the lead guitar over them, which he did, flawlessly.
Life that seems to fade away, drifting farther every day,
Bean crooned, his deep voice dragging up to each note as if he was pulling each one out of his soul. The audience accompanied. To play Fade to Black had been Jacob's idea, a throwback to their early days as a band. It was the first song they ever practiced together. The first time they'd played it in front of friends, it was met with glowing approval, and they'd included it in their set until recently, when it had been relegated to the encore song. Jacob wasn't surprised. He knew why. Since it was his idea to play the song to begin with, and it was a fan favorite, Bean had to exert some type of control over it. After all, only Bean's ideas were accepted since he was, quote, older and wiser than the others. He was indeed older, but he didn't make all the decisions. In fact, Jacob wrote 90% of the music. Bean was the lyricist. Benz was along for the ride. Following the show, praise was heaped on them by adoring fans. Their encore was over by 9:40 p.m., but it was 10:10 p.m. by the time they got off the stage. Fans hung out, trying to talk to the band, mostly Bean, until the club's bouncers kicked them out. Bean managed to invite virtually the whole club to his apartment. It was Friday night, and none of them were scheduled to work the next day. That could mean only one thing: party time. Jacob helped Benz break down the drums and load them in his car. Then Benz helped Jacob with his guitar, amp, and miscellaneous equipment. Benz drove away a few minutes later, presumably headed for Bean's apartment. Jacob stood by Bean's car, waiting for him to finish mingling or whatever he was doing inside. 5 minutes passed. The back door of the club opened. Bean poked his head out. "Dude, how about a little help over here?" Bean said, motioning with his head. Jacob understood that Bean was asking, no, demanding, Jacob carry his bass amplifier for him. It happened every show. Evidently, he was too good to lug it himself. Jacob was not only the musical composer and guitarist, but also Bean's personal roadie. Jacob fetched the amp, which was still on the stage. How Bean had been inside for all that time and only managed to put his bass guitar in its carrying case was beyond Jacob. He carried the heavy amp down the hallway past Bean, who was chatting with the club's owner. As he passed, Jacob spied the owner discreetly handing Bean a wad of cash before shaking his hand. He was floored. "We're getting paid?" Jacob thought. Until now, being paid for gigs hadn't even occurred to him. Jacob loved playing shows and would have been happy to perform for free for the rest of his life. But seeing what he'd just seen, he couldn't help but wonder, how many other times had they been paid without his knowledge? A surge of betrayal washed over him. Jacob turned his face, pretending he had not just seen the transaction. Bean eyed him curiously. He was standing by Bean's car a few moments later. His head rested in his hands, his mind raced. "I'm ready to get hammered," Bean said, startling Jacob. He hadn't heard Bean walk out of the club. He looked up to see his bandleader approaching with a sly grin. Jacob wondered whether Bean recalled telling him to find another ride home before the show. He was sure Bean would have forgotten by now, but wisely kept silent about it just in case. "Yeah, totally," Jacob replied. Bean popped the trunk, and Jacob stowed both of their amplifiers. It was tight, but they fit. He placed the guitar and bass cases in the back seat, getting into the front seat. He hoped Bean wouldn't suddenly say, "Where do you think you're going?" Thankfully, as he hoped, Bean gave him a ride, as if his earlier rant had never even taken place. On their way home, Bean stopped by a local liquor store that was renowned for selling alcohol to minors. Of course, they checked ID cards, but it was more for the sake of the surveillance cameras than the clerks verifying the dates. The staff knew Bean very well. He'd been a frequent customer even when he wasn't buying booze, buying their alcohol prior to being of legal drinking age and cigarettes for even longer. "All right, bro, what do you want? Cough up the dough," Bean said. Jacob resisted the urge to reply, "Why don't you use the money the club owner gave you?" Instead, he handed Bean $10 and only asked for a 40-ounce malt liquor. Any brand, whichever was the cheapest. Bean could keep the rest for gas money, he said. "I like the way you're thinking already, roommate," Bean said. Jacob's stomach turned. 10 minutes later, they entered the apartment to find that the party had started without them. It wasn't much of a surprise, since people who didn't live there seemed to always be there, even when none of the legal residents were. In this case, it was Benz who had initiated the partying. Bean had entrusted him with a key, something he still hadn't done for Jacob. The music was turned up to a level just below what would cause the neighbors to complain. They were playing, what else? Smoke Ring's new demo album they'd recorded last month. Working at a record store had granted Bean some serious music industry connections. Booking studio time had been a cinch. Jacob looked around the room and counted 10 guys, including Benz, and at least a dozen scantily clad goth girls. "Yo, yo, yo!" came Benz's voice from somewhere behind the cloud of cigarette and marijuana smoke. "What's up, what's up, what's up?" Bean hollered in reply, holding aloft one of his newly purchased beer bottles. There were several cheers and woo-hoos as he began to intermingle with the small crowd in his living room. "Hey, everybody, listen up," Bean called, causing the partiers to quiet down. The stereo was muted as well. "Right before our show tonight, Jacob, our guitar player, had to get out of the place where he was living, so he'll be staying here with us. You all know him, so let's give him a good housewarming party." The cheers began anew. Some of the guys came up to Jacob and put their arms around him. Some offered him beers, which he gladly accepted, despite already working on finishing his 40. There was a water tobacco pipe, also known as a bong, being passed around. It wasn't being used for tobacco. Jacob gladly partook in that, too. He was both high and drunk before he knew it, sitting on the couch. He didn't remember how it started, but he found himself talking to a cute blonde girl. He wasn't sure what they were talking about, he just knew she was a hottie. She said she loved his guitar playing, or at least he thought she said something about that. He was so wasted it took him 10 minutes to realize she was the girl from their show, the Abercrombie model, the one that had been staring at him. She'd shed her red flannel and Smoke Rings t-shirt. She was now wearing a revealing black camisole. He vaguely remembered her scooting closer. He thought he recalled her running her fingers through his long purple hair. She was so close. Were they kissing? She smelled good. A light, floral scent. It was so familiar. He woke up the next afternoon on the bathroom floor next to the toilet. You've been listening to By the Fire. Hey, tell us what you think. Leave us a review on Apple, Spotify, Google, or wherever you download your podcasts. Or send me an email. info@davesmail.com. info@davesmaile.com. Thank you so much for listening. This is a work of fiction. Names, characters, businesses, places, events, and incidents are either the products of the author's imagination or used in a fictitious manner. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental.